Hey everyone, it's Mark from Flight Sim School. Today we're going to be looking at how to create a flight plan that we can fly without any navigational instruments in the airplane, how to pick waypoints that are going to be easy to follow once we're in the air, and we'll look at everything else that you need to know to plan a VFR flight in Microsoft Flight Sim. The way the world is generated is a true game changer when it comes to doing VFR flying because of how it builds everything dynamically based on satellite data. So if you want to get the most from it on your next cross-country flight, make sure to stick around. Put simply, VFR flying means that you need to always be able to see where you're going to avoid mountains, buildings, the ground, and other airplanes, as well as navigate to where you're trying to go by using ground references only. But as we're going to see, there are some times where you can also fall back on some tools that you have in the plane to help you out, especially in the era of glass cockpits. All we really need though on this flight is a stopwatch and a compass to measure the distance and direction that we've flown, and with that we'll be able to find our way by following our waypoints on the ground. In the real world, there are a bunch of rules that define when you can and can't fly VFR, but in Flight Sim you can play a little bit more fast and loose. So the main thing that I'm looking for is to be able to stay at a safe altitude and stay out of the clouds at all times. So with that in mind, I try to keep a minimum of 1,000 feet above ground level, on top of making sure that I can keep about 500 feet below any clouds. So for example, if the cloud layer is at 5,000 feet and the area I'm traveling is at or near sea level, then that's not going to be a problem because I'll have a good 3,000-ish feet to play with. On the other hand, if the clouds are down at 1,500 feet, then maybe it won't be a great day to do a VFR flight because the ceiling is so low and you'll have to fly really low to the ground to avoid the clouds, which is something else entirely called scud running, and we won't be looking at that today. There is one other possibility though, because one thing you can do is fly VFR on top of the clouds, but you still can't fly through them to get there or to get back down to the ground. So if you're looking at fewer scattered clouds, then it's definitely doable to fly around them and get above. But if you're looking at more like broken or overcast conditions, then it's not going to be an option. Even if you could get up there, you wouldn't be able to see enough of the ground to be able to navigate properly anyways. The other thing that's equally as important for VFR flying is the visibility, and I'm looking for something like 15 to 20 miles minimum because the reality is I'm likely flying in an area that I'm not very familiar with, if at all. So being able to see that little bit further where I'm going is going to make all the difference between me getting there or not. We'll loop back around to all of that a little bit later when we pick our final cruise altitude, but for now, since we've got our VFR minimums and our understanding of what VFR actually is out of the way, let's have a look at how to actually plan a route. And for today, what we're going to be doing is a flight from Long Beach in Southern California out to Palm Springs. I'm using Navigraph today to do the planning, but you can also use free tools like Little Navmap or SkyVector, because the concepts we're going to be looking at today are going to be the same regardless of the tool you're using. But as we're going to see, just like with the IFR planning video that I did a while back, Navigraph is just a great one-stop shop for all of this stuff. To make sure that we get the right info for planning a VFR flight, we'll want to make sure that we've picked the VFR map layer to start. And then in the layers, you'll want to make sure that the VFR waypoints are being shown on the map as well. Then from there, we can head into the options and you'll want to toggle the flight mode into VFR, and that's going to show us the distance and bearing between all of the waypoints of our route. So right now our route is a straight line from A to B, and if we were to get airborne and point our airplane in the general direction of Palm Springs on a sunny day, we might eventually get there, but the odds aren't very high. So to more reliably find our way, we're going to want to break down the route into legs and use references that we can easily identify on the ground, be it an airport, a lake, a large building, or anything like that that can take us from point to point. And I'll usually try to have a waypoint like this every 10 miles or so. Since we're starting off in a large urban area, there are going to be plenty of landmarks that we can use. We might actually have the opposite problem where it's hard to pick something because there's just so much going on. So what we're going to do is we'll start by looking on the map to see if we can identify any waypoints that are specifically designated for VFR routes, because they'll usually be easier to pick out from the sky. For example, if we look to the east, there is a Disneyland VFR waypoint that's not too far away. And if we switch into satellite mode, we can even see what that waypoint looks like from the air before we fly it. So that'll start building our mental picture of the route, and it'll also give us a pretty good idea if we think that's going to be a good waypoint to use or not. Just to the right of that, we also have Anaheim Stadium, which is surrounded by pavements, so that should be pretty easy to pick out when we're flying it in the sim. So I'll go ahead and add this one as our first waypoint of the route. It's about 12 miles from our departure point in Long Beach out to Disneyland, so that would theoretically work for our first leg. However, for the first waypoint after takeoff, I prefer to have something that's a little bit closer, that's going to be easy to spot without having to time the distance and direction that we're flying. Lucky for us though, we have the naval station that's right between our two waypoints, so I'm going to add this one to my route as well so it splits that leg into two. That's something you're going to see me do a lot as we're going through this planning phase here is I'll add a waypoint, I'll have a look to see how far it is, and if it's a little bit further than I would like, I'll add another waypoint in the middle, hopefully, to be able to break that leg down just a little bit more. On top of that, once we're actually flying it, we'll use the roads as well to cross-reference our position, and we'll time how long we're flying from point to point to make sure that we don't end up missing a waypoint. This is probably a good point to do a small sidebar and talk about airspace rules, which for the most part I tend to ignore because I don't use the built-in ATC. But right now I'm much more likely to fly on VATSIM or IVAO where I'm going to have real controllers, and the rules for how the airspace works there is fairly different from the real world, so we won't focus on any of that in this video. The other thing that I want to point out while we're at it is there is also a new layer in Navigraph in the US that you can see the real FAA sectional charts. So if you want to increase your realism, you can use them. But personally, I prefer the VFR map. It's just a little bit easier to see waypoints, where the built up areas and cities are, and all of that good stuff. Alright, back to our route. So from Disneyland, we still have to go further east, and the next thing that I want to draw your attention to is the solid black lines with arrows on them, which is something called a VFR Flyway, and that basically provides you with recommended routes and altitudes that you can use to avoid busy and congested areas. There's two that we could use from where we are, but I'm going to use the one that's more to the south since it aligns better with the direction of flight that we have so far. And then from there, I'm going to use Pleasant's Peak as my next waypoint since that one's all the way up to 5,000 feet. So it'll be very easily visible, and it's just to the south of the flyway that we're following. That's going to be 16 miles, so it's a little bit further than I would have liked, but considering the mountain is pretty high, I don't think it'll be a problem. And then from there, our next waypoint is going to be an obvious one with the lake that's just a little bit further down the flyway. Now from here is where things get interesting again, because there's a mountain range between us and Palm Springs, but there is just one gap to get through near the town of Banning, and there also happens to be an airport there. So we can use that whole area as our waypoint to find our way into the valley. It's a good 30 miles between our last waypoint at the lake all the way to here though, so we're gonna need at least one more waypoint between the two. And again, we're pretty lucky to have a couple of choices that we can see. There's an airport, which would work fine, of course, and there's also a reservoir just a little bit further east as well. I'm gonna pick the reservoir just because generally flight sim seems to generate lakes and water bodies fairly well, although there are definitely a few exceptions that I've run into, but since we'll be timing our legs, we should be all right regardless. On top of that, by the time that we get here, we should also be able to see the gap in the mountain range in front of us. So we'll really be able to use all of those visual cues to find our way. Now from here to Palm Springs, there isn't all that much, but there is a highway and a railroad that run in the direction where we're going, so we should be able to follow that pretty easily all the way to our destination, and that'll generally apply to anywhere that you're flying in Flight Sim. The highways are one thing that I think you can reliably use almost anywhere. But on top of that, we're also going to use a nav aid to help guide us here. That happens to be a VOR in this case, and we can track that either with our traditional nav radios or a GPS unit if that's what we have on board. And we're going to look at how to do all of that in the next video when we fly this route. The other thing that we can do in Navigraph is create custom waypoints, which comes in really handy when you run into something that could be a good VFR waypoint, but for whatever reason, there actually isn't one that's already available on the base map. If I zoom in a little bit, we can see that there's a wind turbine farm along the highway that would make for a great waypoint. So I'm going to right click on the map where I want to add it. That's going to show us a purple crosshair where I clicked. And then from there, I just have to click the Add User Waypoint button. That's going to bring up a little window where I need to give the waypoint a name. So I'm going to use something simple but clear enough to be able to know what it is. And then in the scope, I'm going to pick flight so that the waypoint we're creating now is only available for the flight that we're planning today. That's created the waypoint. And then from there, I can add it to my route by pressing the Add to Route button. And now that's loaded our custom waypoint into the flight plan, which we should be able to see as well in Flight Sim if we were to load the flight plan via the world map. That's pretty much our full route from Long Beach out to Palm Springs. So at this point, we can button down our final cruise altitude, which is going to be dependent on the weather conditions that we're flying in, but there's a couple of other factors to keep in mind as well. The general rule for VFR cruise altitudes, at least in North America, is to pick an altitude that's going to be in the odd thousands of feet when you're traveling eastbound and the even thousands when you're traveling westbound. So one mnemonic that I've heard that you can use to remember it more easily is to say that east is odd and west is even odder. Although I actually tend to prefer east is odd and west is even weirder, because at least like that you're not repeating odd in both parts of the sentence. You're then supposed to add 500 feet to that. So if you're flying east, your cruise altitude could be something like 3,500 feet or 5,500. And if you were traveling westbound, then it would be something more like 4,500 or 6,500. On top of that, if you're going to be using a flyway for any part of your flight, you can also check that too, because it's often going to have recommendations on what altitudes to use to help you avoid the busier and more complex areas to fly in. The flyway that we're going to be loosely traveling on from Disney all the way out to Banning says that we should try to be between 5,500 and 7,500 feet. And since we're going to be going east, that leaves us with pretty much those two altitudes as our ideal options, but that's still going to be dependent on a few more factors. One of those things is what the elevation profile looks like along our route. And as of the time I'm recording this, you have to do this by hand in Navigraph. So what I'll usually do is start by decluttering the map layer as much as possible so that I can see the elevation data a bit better. First part of the flight is basically at sea level until we get to Pleasance Peak. That goes up to just under 4,000 feet. And then from there, it goes back down almost to sea level, it seems, until we get to the town of Banning, which looks like it's sitting at around 2,000 feet. And then from there, it drops off again all the way to Palm Springs. So based on all of that, our max elevation is going to be around 4,000 feet. That leaves us with only two options then, 5,500 or 7,500. So to make the decision, we're going to have a look at the cloud coverage, the precipitation, and the winds as well. I'll bring the weather layer up then and switch it into cloud cover. And then we're going to play with the altitude selector to see what's going on at our potential cruise altitudes. I'll usually scan through 2,000, 6,000, and 10,000 feet for the next couple of hours by moving through the timeline. But for today, it really doesn't look like there's anything at all on the weather report, which isn't too surprising, I guess, since the weather in Southern California is almost always the same. If there had been some cloud coverage, we'd look at how much there actually was, what altitude it's at, and make a judgment call to decide if we're going to stay below them or go above, like we discussed in the beginning part of the video. Let's look at the wind next, and this is another situation where decluttering the map helps to be able to see the wind barbs a lot easier. The wind is pretty light today, from 2,000 feet all the way up to 10,000. So again, it's not a factor, but what I'm normally looking for is the altitude that's going to give me the highest tailwind or the lowest headwind so that I can get the highest ground speed possible. So for now, I'm going to plan for 5,500 feet just to keep my options open, especially since cloud and wind conditions can and do change before and during a flight. But having gone through the planning phase now, we know what our minimum cruise altitude should be as well as our maximum altitude. So we're as prepared as we can be for anything that the weather throws at us. With all of that said, we're ready to fly our route, but that's going to be in another video that'll be coming out in a few weeks' time. So make sure that you like this video if you learned something useful, and subscribe so that you don't miss out on the next part of this VFR flying series.